A white cop named Henry prevents black FBI agent Esther Wallace from accessing her own office, challenges her authority, and a miscommunication swiftly turns into public humiliation. He immediately regrets his error, but the repercussions are far worse than either of them could have imagined. Having pictured where you are in the world before we begin the story, please leave a remark below. Viewing starting now, and remember to subscribe if you enjoy this tale. Esther Wallace emerged from her vehicle, her weary eyes squinting in the bright morning light as the FBI headquarters loomed before her. After 15 years of service, despite her fatigue, she stretched, feeling the pain in her muscles from a hard night of covert labor. With another successful operation under her belt, a smile appeared on her lips. Her usual sharp suit was a far cry from her casual wear, but after playing the role of a small-time drug dealer for hours in a dimly lit warehouse, comfort was all that mattered to her. Esther, with short curly hair, inhaled deeply and began to walk toward the building. With every step, she felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion. She enjoyed her work and the rush of apprehending criminals, yet she felt both pride and exhaustion. At times, the burden of everything seemed nearly unbearable, and as she got closer to the door, her thoughts wandered. Being a black woman in the FBI wasn't simple. She had battled valiantly for every promotion, every sliver of respect, and is currently among the most successful agents in her division. She continued to experience the pain of discrimination all too frequently. She considered the glances she occasionally received from coworkers, the whispers that followed her down the corridors, and where skepticism began to creep in. It was common while discussing her most recent bust or wondering how she acquired her job. Today was calm, but she pushed those ideas away and straightened her shoulders, realizing that she was here because she had earned it due to her exceptional work skills and lack of prejudice or discrimination could take that away from her. The evidence she had obtained throughout the course of the night would be essential in dismantling a significant narcotics network. It was important work that had an impact, yet even as she concentrated on the task at hand, a tiny part of her wondered how many more she could do. Could she withstand the continual emotional toll that came from backhanded compliments and sidelong glances? Esther shook her head in an attempt to dispel any worries she had about her ability to perform her work successfully. She knew in her heart that she would eventually have to face these emotions head-on. Esther Wallace was prepared to tackle the task at hand, and Henry Mitchell stood watch close to the side entrance of the FBI headquarters. He took pride in his ability to monitor the surroundings with trained attentiveness, thinking that his vigilant observation was the first line of protection against potential threats. As he observed, his immaculate clothing and stern face demonstrated how seriously he took his work. Henry's attention was drawn to a woman walking toward the building in the parking lot. She was wearing casual clothing, which stood in sharp contrast to the typical suited agents who frequently visited this entryway. Henry's brow furrowed as his suspicions quickly heightened. He hesitated before moving forward and taking a wide stance in front of the side entrance. As he watched the woman approach, he crossed his arms across his chest because something about her bothered him. Despite his inability to pinpoint the reason, Henry yelled out, "Excuse me, ma'am." Esther glanced up at Henry as the woman reached for the building entrance. "I'll need to see some identification." She took her FBI credentials out of her pocket and held them up for him to see, her fatigue visible in her eyes. Despite her fatigue, Agent Esther Wallace remarked in a calm voice, "I'm Agent Esther Wallace." Henry, who had just returned from an undercover mission, narrowed his eyes as he looked at the badge she had taken from her hands, flipping it over and carefully examining it, even though the credentials' legitimacy was obvious. He kept thinking, "This doesn't look like a standard issue badge." "You certainly don't look like an FBI agent," Henry stated in a contemptuous tone. He examined her from head to toe, his eyes resting on her relaxed outfit. Esther felt a tightness in her chest that she had seen far too often, a combination of hurt and frustration. Officer Mitchell added, "That badge is," before she could reassure you. "Sincere, as I indicated, I recently returned from an undercover mission, which explains my relaxed demeanor," Henry remarked. "I'm going to need to verify this," his demeanor unwavering. He said in a condescending tone, "You understand, can't be too careful these days." The tension was still obstructing Esther's path as Henry reached for his radio. Between them, Esther remained firm, her tolerance waning, but her poise unwavering. She had encountered this type of treatment previously, but the conflict between Esther and Henry persisted in intensifying, attracting the attention of surrounding staff members with a little audience starting to assemble, their curious gazes focused on the sight as it developed. As more people paused to observe Henry shaking his head while still holding Esther's badge, whispers began to fill the air. "I apologized, but I must require you to undergo additional security procedures," he continued, his voice tinged with authority. Esther felt the weight of the spectators and her heart fell. Fighting to maintain her composure, she replied, "Officer Mitchell, I've showed you my credentials. I'm an FBI agent who returned from an undercover mission. No further procedures are required." "You don't appear to be an FBI agent, ma'am." His comments pierced the atmosphere, and until I confirm your identity, Esther felt her cheeks burn with shame, and she was well aware of the surrounding whispers, the critical looks, and the pity. "Look, Mitchell," Esther asked, her voice. "What do you mean by that, officer?" Henry shifted uneasily, but she needed him to say the answer aloud, because she knew it, barely above a whisper. Knowing that he had entered a risky area, "I mean, you're not wearing clothes like an agent with your badge." The murmurs of the crowd increased in volume. Some people shook their heads in dismay, while others gazed in astonishment and curiosity. Esther inhaled deeply in an attempt to quiet the boiling emotional storm inside of her after confronting prejudice previously, but never so openly or directly outside the structure where she spent years of her life pursuing justice. "I am a senior FBI officer," replied Officer Mitchell, her voice wavering a little. "Being unable to see past my image as an experienced agent is not only unprofessional, but also fundamentally painful," and other people in the crowd started to support Esther. "Come on, dude. She showed you her badge," and then someone shouted, "This is absurd. Let her through." But Henry said, "I'm simply doing my job," he said, standing his ground, his cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and tenacity. He felt tears welling up at the insistence that everyone adhere to protocol. She blinked back the corners of her eyes, determined not to exhibit her feelings, but on the inside, she was breaking. Given this man's prejudice toward the crowd, her efforts to prove herself and put in a lot of hard work looked pointless. The crowd grew larger and the tension in the air increased. Esther stood her identity and value being questioned in front of her, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. Like Esther, colleague understood that the humiliation she experienced in public would stick with her for a long time. A familiar voice broke through the tension as she felt her patience waning. "What in the world is happening here?" The superior officer of Agent Santos Esther strode over to them with a look of bewilderment and rage on his face. The crowd moved to let him through, and while Esther stood there, her Agent Santos took in the image and felt a feeling of comfort pass over her. Officer Mitchell Santos remarked. Henry, who was still holding her badge with a stubborn expression, looked tired and hurt. Henry's cheeks paled. "Sir, would you mind explaining why you're holding one of my top operatives in custody?" His voice was as harsh as a razor. "I was just following the rules, but this woman doesn't appear like an FBI agent." Santos paused, his eyes glowing furiously. "Is that an FBI agent?" The audience around them fell silent as you spoke, waiting for every word. Santos continued, his voice rising, and Esther stood motionless, her heart thumping in her chest. "This is Special Agent Esther Wallace, one of our most esteemed and decorated agents, in addition to being an FBI agent. She just returned from a risky covert operation, officers, and this is how you treat her." Henry's face flushed a deep scarlet as he glanced from Santos to Esther, realizing his serious mistake. Agent Wallace has resolved more cases and apprehended more offenders throughout his career, Santos said to the entire audience. Not only Henry, her commitment and talent are unquestionable. Unable to get past your own prejudice, which is dishonorable and goes against all we value in the FBI. Esther was grateful that Santos stood up, but she also felt a knot in her throat. The fact that it was all public only made her humiliation worse because she could see the dismay and compassion on the faces of her coworkers, and it made her feel insignificant. Henry stood there stunned. He opened his mouth to speak, but he refrained because he realized then that what he was doing would have grave consequences. As a result, the crowd started to lose their enthusiasm, but Esther could still hear their whispers as they left. Despite Santos' statements, the harm had already been done based on their sidelong stares. She thought that as the last of the spectators left, Esther's feeling of dignity and respect had been permanently ruined. The weight of what had just transpired weighed heavily in the air as Esther stood there with Santos and Henry. Despite her conflicting feelings, she kept her head up as she entered the FBI building, and the chilly air conditioning hit her cheeks in sharp contrast to the intense shame she had experienced just seconds before when she walked to her office. Her coworkers' whispers and looks followed her like a shadow. Esther shut the door to her office and leaned against it, finally releasing a trembling breath due to the stress of what had transpired with pressure on her shoulders. She had already experienced discrimination, but it felt different this time, more unfiltered and public. Her mind was overflowing with similar experiences, including the time she was mistaken for a cleaner at a crime scene, and the innumerable times her opinions were disregarded in meetings but appreciated when they were brought up by white coworkers. Every memory of those times hurt. Esther looked at the framed awards and praise on her wall, which served as a reminder of the ongoing struggle she endured. She had put in a great deal of effort and sacrifice to reach her current position. But in that moment, she questioned whether it was all worthwhile and how many more humiliations and opportunities she would have to prove herself. She had to suffer the day, which seemed to drag on for an hour at a time, until she arrived home that evening feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. The morning's events replayed in her memory as she kicked off her shoes and slid into her favorite armchair, considering how she went from being a small child hoping to change the world to being one of the top agents in the FBI. She had broken through numerous barriers and conquered numerous hurdles, but today's incident caused Esther's eyes to stray to a picture of her FBI graduating class while she asked all of her questions. Her younger self, full of hope and resolve, grinned back at the academy. That optimism was misguided, and for the first time in her career, Esther was engaged in a losing war. She thought about quitting the FBI, which made her feel both relieved and afraid. Could she abandon everything she had worked for? But could she continue to live in a facility where she was still confronted with obvious prejudice? Esther's imagination was filled with possibilities as the night went on, despite the obvious prejudice. She envisioned a life without the incessant pressure to prove herself, one in which her value would not be questioned due to the hue of her skin, but she also considered the situations she had resolved and the lives she had transformed. Esther felt conflicted about the emotional impact of the morning's events and the difference she'd made. Given her commitment to justice and her need for self-defense, she was aware that whatever choice she made would permanently alter her life's path. Henry stood by himself in the security office, his hands shaking as he mentally reenacted the morning's events, feeling as though his acts were pressing down on him, making it difficult for him to breathe. "What have I done?" He sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. The vision of Esther's face was muttered to himself, his voice breaking with passion. Henry had always taken pleasure in being a decent guy, and his recollection was marked with hurt and rage. He had always treated everyone equally, but now he had to face a painful reality about himself. His acts weren't merely a mistake. The awareness that they were based on prejudice struck him like a kick to the stomach. He evaluated Esther based on only her appearance, allowing his prejudices to cloud his judgment. Henry's gut rumbled when he considered the possibility that he might lose his job as a result of his conduct. However, a tiny voice in the recesses of his mind suggested that perhaps he deserved it. "How could I have been so unaware?" he mumbled, shaking his head in shock, having always considered racism to be something blatantly negative. People did, but he now understood that it might be a clever way to hide behind presumptions and snap judgments. As he sat there, Henry had a profound wave of shame. Henry started to doubt everything about himself, including if he was capable of doing this and what other biases he might be hiding. Henry's mind raced between the man he believed himself to be and the man his actions exposed. He was attempting to determine how he might make things right, but would an apology suffice given that he had embarrassed Esther in front of her coworkers, injuring her and possibly tarnishing her reputation? Henry was genuinely troubled by the magnitude of his error and realized that he needed to do more than simply apologize. He wanted to change, but where would he start? Esther Wallace walked the following morning, her head hung high as she entered FBI headquarters, but the memories weighed heavily on her heart. As she walked to her office, the shame from yesterday hung over her like a shadow, and she could feel her colleagues' curious looks. Agent Santos welcomed her. Wallace at her desk stated in a soft voice, "I have a new case for you. It's a series of crimes targeting black-owned businesses in the area." Esther nodded. "I believe you're the best person for this given the recent spate of crimes targeting black-owned businesses in the area." She settled in and said, "Thank you, sir, for the distraction. I'll get right on it." Esther tried to ignore the feelings she was still feeling from yesterday because she had a job to complete and people to see. They were relying on her, but even as she opened the case file, she saw Henry's face and heard his contemptuous remarks. An hour later, Esther sat at the head of the conference table with the words reverberating in her ears. By her team, she inhaled deeply and resolved to concentrate on the task at hand. Despite the chaos within, she started out with a firm voice. "All right, team. We've been seeing a series of break-ins and vandalism incidents targeting black-owned businesses in the downtown area. Let's review what we've gathered so far." As Esther's co-workers exchanged ideas and information, she noticed that her thoughts were straying and corrected them. Henry's comments were replaying in her mind as she stared blankly at the evidence board. "You don't look like an FBI agent." She was brought back to reality by the voice of Agent Rodriguez, not Agent Wallace, concernedly observing her. "Are you all right?" Esther blinked, remembering she'd missed the last few minutes of the conversation. She felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, but quickly sat up straight in her chair. She said, "Could you repeat that last part?" Rodriguez reviewed the details once again, and Esther privately chastised herself, saying that she was better than this. She had worked too hard to allow one naive man to undermine her self-confidence, but doubts still surfaced even as she made an effort to concentrate on the case. Did she truly belong here, and would she need to prove herself constantly? Esther ignored the thoughts as she ascended, intending to focus entirely on the case. She wasn't going to disappoint these business owners who needed her assistance, but as the meeting went on, she couldn't get rid of the sensation that something had changed within her. The Henry incident had left a mark. Henry Mitchell waited outside the FBI headquarters, his heart thumping in his chest, knowing that it wouldn't easily fade away. He had been struggling with shame and remorse for the past few days, and he knew he needed to make amends. He took a deep breath. When Henry reached Esther's desk, the busy office grew silent as he pushed open the door and entered. "Agent Wallace." Henry spoke in a trembling voice as she looked up, her eyes opening in surprise and then narrowing cautiously. "I was hoping to speak with you." Esther looked around, conscious of her coworkers' curious looks. "Yes," she answered in a neutral tone. "Let's go outside." They strolled to a peaceful area of the corridor. Henry wiped his sweaty palms on his uniform. He started saying, "What I did was wrong, and I wanted to apologize. I genuinely apologize for treating you unfairly and for allowing my prejudices to cloud my judgment." Henry noticed that Esther was listening with a mask of courteous attention, but he could see the pain in her eyes and the fatigue in her posture. He claimed that Esther's voice was cool, but you must realize that this isn't just one instance. Henry nodded, feeling the weight of a lifetime of encounters like this. "I'm aware," he spoke quietly, "but I'm not sure how that will help." Esther slumped her shoulders and asked, "Is there anything I can do to make up for my mistake?" "I'm not sure, Henry, but this isn't something that can be resolved with a small apology or a large gesture. The goal is to change deeply rooted beliefs and actions that made Henry feel defeated. He had hoped for forgiveness, seeking an opportunity to put things right, but he now understood that it wasn't that easy. I get it, he added in a voice. I regret what I did, but I want you to know that I can't take it back. Esther nodded, but her expression said, I'm determined to do better to learn and grow. She stayed cautious, which is a good start, but actions speak louder than words. Henry realized he still had a long way to go before he could demonstrate his sincerity as they stood there in awkward silence, but he was determined to find a way, no matter how long it took. She let out a deep breath when she saw the small bakery with its boarded up windows and a closed sign hanging crookedly on the door. She got out of her car and went to three black owned businesses today, all of which were affected by the recent string of crimes. An elderly woman with gray hair appeared from the side alley as she got closer to the entrance. You must be Agent Wallace, the woman muttered in a tired sounding voice, and Esther nodded, giving a kind smile. Yes, ma'am, I'm here to assist. Mrs. Johnson led Esther into the interior of the bakery, which was in disarray, with broken display cases upturned. Esther's stomach knotted at the tables and the racist epithets spray painted on the walls. This is my mother's bakery, Miss Johnson said, her eyes glistening with tears that hadn't been shed. I've operated it for 30 years and never imagined seeing the day when someone would do this. I can assure you, Mrs. Johnson. Esther put a consoling hand on the woman's shoulder. We're going to find out who it was that day. Esther started to ask questions and make notes, but her thoughts kept returning to the Henry incident. The feeling of embarrassment at being viewed as an outsider at her own place of employment entered her mind, and she shook her head in an attempt to concentrate on Mrs. Johnson's words. But she was finding it more difficult to separate her feelings from the pain and annoyance she saw in these business owners' eyes reflected her own difficulties later on at the FBI. Esther spent the afternoon going over her notes in her car. She had been to 5 different businesses today, each with a story more devastating than the previous one. The weight of their experiences and her own recent struggle felt overwhelming. She peered in the rearview mirror and saw a weary face staring back at her. Will it ever change? Not only from the hard hours, but also from years of fighting for recognition and respect. As Esther drove back to the FBI headquarters, she spoke in a barely audible whisper to herself. She began to feel lonely as she considered her coworkers and wondered how many of them actually recognized the difficulties she encountered on a daily basis. As the FBI building appeared in the distance, Esther felt a knot form in her stomach. Once a source of pride, it now felt like an emblem of the institution in her stomach. She parked her car and sat there for a while, gathering her strength to change. Esther took a deep breath of strength and got out of her car. As she approached the entrance, she couldn't help but wonder if the FBI would ever fully embrace diversity or genuinely change its methods, as the road ahead appeared to be lengthy and unsure, but she was aware that the struggle for justice for her community and herself was far from over. Henry Mitchell paced his tiny office back and forth, his thoughts whirling with the event involving Esther Wallace that had rocked him to his core, causing him to face feelings of sorrow and guilt over his own prejudices, and he was aware that he needed to do more than simply apologize. He had to take action. Henry took a deep breath before heading to Esther's department. His heart was racing as he got to her desk where Agent Wallace sat going over the case files quietly. With a slight shudder, I wanted to ask if I might talk to you for a second. Esther nodded as Officer Mitchell Henry gulped hard as she looked up, her expression guarded. I know that I can't take back what I did, but I still want to learn and let me help you in whatever way I can to contribute to the solution. Esther's eyebrows shot up in surprise as she looked at Henry's face, trying to find the slightest indication of dishonesty. She nodded softly after a lengthy silence. You can begin by assisting me in organizing these witness accounts, Officer Mitchell. As the days went by, Henry discovered himself deeply involved in the inquiry, initially accompanying Esther to speak with business owners impacted by the crimes. Henry encountered suspicion and icy looks when he arrived, but as he heard their stories, he started to see the world from a different angle. One afternoon, they went to a small barber shop where the owner, Mr. Smith, had been vandalized. Mr. Smith described how, as a black business owner, He had encountered years of covert prejudice and structural obstacles. It's not only about this particular occurrence, he described in an emotional manner, saying that it's a lifetime of being treated as though we don't belong. As Henry saw the similarities between Mr. Smith's comments and his own, a knot formed in his throat. He looked at Esther and saw the understanding in her eyes as she nodded in agreement with Mr. Smith's comments. Henry turned to Esther as they were leaving the barber shop. I didn't know what he was saying. In a quiet way, I knew racism existed, but I had no idea how pervasive it was. It had an impact on every aspect of people's lives, and Henry's question was that Esther's expression softened a little. Since it doesn't directly affect them, many people don't notice it, but for us, it's a daily reality. Henry nodded in reality, feeling a mixture of shame and resolve. I want to improve. He really stated, I want to understand and contribute to real change for the first time since that moment. Esther smiled slightly at him, which startled Henry. Esther and Henry began delving deeper into the case as the inquiry went on, following the leads they had gathered. The pair decided to go undercover to obtain more information from a local gang that has a history of attacking black-owned businesses. Details of setting up a stakeout in a plain van parked across from a known gang hangout in the small area of the van made them sit next to each other, surrounded by security cameras, and the tension was palpable. However, as the hours passed, it gradually started to fade, and Henry broke the silence first. He added quietly, his gaze focused on the building as they watched, I want you to know that working on this case has opened my eyes. Henry took a long breath, his expression cautious but intrigued by how much he recognized the magnitude of the difficulties black business owners face, the ongoing fear of discrimination, and the harsh treatment overpowering him. Your eyes are softening a little. It's not only business owners. Every day I witness Henry's admission, his voice full of regret for all of us. I didn't realize how privileged I was, and the way I handled you that day wasn't merely an error. It was a sign of a far more serious issue. So Esther turned to face him, closely examining his face and realizing that what's wrong is my own stupidity, Henry remarked, looking her in the eyes. I believed I was simply carrying out my duties, but I never gave it much thought as to why I reacted the way I did. I never thought about how my actions could have an impact on someone else. They were silent for a moment, and Esther's face remained neutral, but something, maybe the smallest flicker of hope, was there in her eyes. Admitting that she finally said it is difficult, but realizing that it is the first step, Henry nodded sincerely, saying, I want to improve, I want to understand, and I want to help create genuine change by working with you on this case and seeing the victims of these atrocities. It's transforming me, Esther, and I'm appreciative that Esther permitted a tiny grin to appear on her face. That's excellent to hear, Henry, but keep in mind that this process of learning and growth doesn't stop when this case concludes. It's a lifelong commitment. I know what Henry meant when he spoke with such resolve, and I'm prepared for that commitment. As they carried on their monitoring, the atmosphere between them felt lighter, but Esther was still wary. She could see glimmers of real change in Henry's outlook. It was a minor step, but a crucial one on a lengthy path to equality and understanding. As the inquiry went on, Esther and Henry's relationship started to develop, as did their mutual commitment. They had established a provisional bridge between them to solve the crime, but their newly discovered understanding was about to be tested. One bright afternoon, Esther got a desperate call from an old woman named Mrs. Lewis. Mrs. Lewis, a black entrepreneur who had been a crucial source of information for their research, spoke in a tremulous voice. Agent Wallace, they've been here. They know I've been speaking to you because they left a note in a voice that was just audible above a whisper. Esther was devastated because she had assured Mrs. Lewis that she would be protected, and now the good old woman was in danger and to be calm. Mrs. Lewis, I'm on my way. As Esther hurried out of the office, she immediately grabbed her coat and keys and ran into Henry, who noticed her anxiety. He inquired, What's wrong? With a look on her face, and Esther paused for a second before describing the circumstances. The gang knows that Mrs. Lewis has been assisting us and has been threatened. Henry's expression hardened as he stated, We must protect her. Esther bowed her head in agreement. We can't risk anything happening to her, so I'm going to place her under guarded surveillance while I race. Let me take care of it, Henry said in a steady, serious voice. I can personally guarantee Mrs. Lewis's safety. Esther took a moment to examine Henry's face. She could see the sincerity in his eyes and his sincere wish to assist, but she was unsure. After a brief period of introspection, she was still wondering if she could trust him with something so significant. Esther struggled but ultimately decided that her voice was fine. Cautious yet optimistic. But Henry, Mrs. Lewis's safety comes first. I understand, Esther, but I won't let anything happen to her. Henry nodded firmly. I won't let you down. I swear to do everything in my power to keep her safe, as they swiftly made their way to her tiny bakery. Mrs. Lewis details were given during a briefing as they made their way to her tiny bakery. It was a revered landmark and a pillar of the town for decades. The idea of her being threatened made Esther's blood begin to boil. When they got there and saw Mrs. Lewis sitting behind the counter with her normally happy face drawn, the sight of the weak woman, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with trembling hands, alarmed Esther instantly went to Mrs. Lewis and put a consoling hand on her because of something deep inside both Henry and Esther. Henry murmured softly, We're here, Mrs. Lewis. You're safe. Henry stood out. I'm Officer Mitchell, and I'll be personally supervising your protection, so you don't need to worry. Mrs. Lewis gazed up at Henry, eyes full of hope and terror. Thank you, she whispered, her voice scarcely audible. She couldn't help but look as Esther started to describe the safety precautions they would implement. Henry's resolute posture and kind tone, while reassuring Mrs. Lewis, were a sight to behold. For the first time since their fight, Esther saw him in a light she had never seen before, and she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Henry was genuinely evolving, and maybe by defending Mrs. Lewis, they could both get closer to mending their scars. Discarding the past and creating a more promising future as Henry became comfortable in his position as Mrs. He found himself spending a lot of time at her bakery as Lewis's defender. Unexpected learning occurred in a modest, welcoming store that smelled of freshly made bread and delectable sweets. Mrs. Lewis started telling him her story one peaceful day while she was kneading dough for her renowned cinnamon rolls. Her kind yet powerful voice conveyed years of Henry's life experiences. Officer Mitchell never thought about it, so she started working with her hands. Dough with ease, this bakery is more than just a commercial venture. It's my life's work, my legacy. Henry paid close attention, observing Mrs. Lewis. When I originally opened this place 40 years ago, it wasn't easy. She spoke with pride in her eyes. Moreover, banks refused to lend me money, claiming that a black woman couldn't manage a profitable business, and this Henry's brother in the neighborhood was upset because he had never considered how difficult it may be. Mrs. Lewis had to go on her voice in order for someone like her to even launch a business. Sometimes someone would come in and take one look at me, and I would be tinted with both melancholy and determination, and immediately go again, but I persisted because I couldn't. This wasn't simply, as you can see, it was about demonstrating to our community that we were capable of. Henry felt a burden in his chest as she talked, remembering all the times we belonged here. He had entered shops mindlessly, never realizing how different that experience might be for even now. Mrs. Lewis set her hands, and someone like Esther or Mrs. Lewis, there are difficulties when they pause their employment, and insurance costs are greater for companies in this area. Therefore, we receive less police protection, and in light of these threats, I occasionally question whether it's all worth it. Mrs. Lewis. Henry had a wave of protectiveness. What you've built here is essential, he stated firmly, and I guarantee you we're going to ensure the safety of you and your business. Mrs. Lewis gave him a warm, sincere smile. Henry was both appreciative and embarrassed by her candor, and as the days went by, Henry, feeling guilty of his own ignorance, was profoundly touched by Mrs. Lewis's tenacity. He observed how she mentored him by smiling when she greeted each customer, even on days when business was slow. Neighborhood youths offering them their first jobs and imparting useful skills through Mrs. Lewis's tales, and Henry started to realize, based on his personal experience, That systematic racism had wider effects than just isolated instances of discrimination, but more on the innumerable imperceptible obstacles that individuals like as Mrs. Lewis and Esther confronted every day. And this insight struck Henry hard as he reflected on his encounter with Esther. In a new perspective, it was about a lifetime of experiences rather than just that one episode. Comparable circumstances that Esther had probably encountered as the days stretched into weeks, the gang's threats rose and became more regular as the tension around Mrs. Lewis' bakery increased. Becoming more sinister, Henry was always on edge, his gaze sweeping across each client, who, one very calm evening, approached the store with his hand close to his weapon as for the third occasion that evening. Henry saw a suspicious automobile go by slowly as Mrs. Lewis was closing up her store. He had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Mrs. Lewis, thanks to years of work experience, stated softly, "I believe we should lock up early tonight," and she nodded in her customary upbeat manner. Worry-filled manner as she went to switch out the lights. The front window's glass shattered and flew. Henry responded immediately everywhere, yanking Mrs. Lewis behind the counter and yelling, "Stay down." Two masked individuals with obvious intents rushed through the damaged glass as he heard automobile doors slamming outside. Henry felt he had to make a snap decision, so he got up and diverted their focus from where. "FBI, drop your weapons," he cried steadily as Mrs. Lewis hid. Even though Henry was terrified, the intruders paused, obviously not expecting to be confronted by law authorities, took advantage of their moment of bewilderment and sprang forward to attack the closest assailant, causing them to crash into it as Henry struggled with the first assailant. He noticed the second one in a display of pastries that sent cupcakes and cookies flying. Without thinking, he placed himself in the way of Mrs. Lewis, who was hiding behind the counter. Taking a hard, Henry took a punch to the jaw that made him reel, but he battled back. Back with all he had, his will to keep Mrs. Lewis safe giving him strength he wasn't aware Henry was able to overcome both of them in a brief but fierce battle. As the sirens sounded in the distance, Henry assisted Mrs. Lewis in escaping the assailants who were holding them at gunpoint until help arrived. His fast thinking kept her safe even if she was shook at the feet. Mrs. Lewis remarked, her voice shaking with passion, "Beauty, you saved my life. Thank you. I'm not sure what would have occurred if you weren't here, Henry." Henry felt both relieved and "I'm just glad you're safe, Mrs. Lewis," he said, feeling humbled. When Esther and the other members of the FBI team arrived on the scene, she spoke softly. Her gaze locked with Henry's among the confusion of the bakery and the two defeated assailants. And he noticed a flicker of respect there for the first time since their altercation as Henry offered his declaration to the other agents. He sensed Esther observing him, and he realized that his behavior tonight had begun to close the distance between them. It wasn't about asking for approval or pardon, but rather about acting morally. In the days after Mrs. Lewis' bakery was attacked, Esther and Henry were defending someone in need. Discovered that they were collaborating closely to put the evidence together. The broken glass, abandoned masks, and even the strewn about pastries were all possible hints that could help them find Mrs. Lewis, still startled but willing to assist, sat with them in the center of the gang's operations. Recounting every detail she could recall, FBI office Rex's keen memory, and Mrs. Lewis mentioned that one of them had a tattoo on his wrist, which I recall was a priceless observation. Esther's voice remained firm, but the terror was still visible in her eyes, which resembled a snake encircling a dagger. Nodded while writing down the details, then looked at Henry, who was paying close attention, his face etched with. She couldn't help but note that he appeared different from that day at the entrance, more attentive, more focused. Esther was conscious while they collaborated, reviewing security footage and comparing gang tattoos. Sensed that her resentment of Henry was beginning to subside, and that his commitment to the case and sincere care for Mrs. Lewis where every action was clear. One afternoon, as they were going over witness statements, Henry turned to Esther and said, "I know I can." He said softly, "I can never fully understand what you go through, but working on this case has opened my eyes. I want to improve so that I can be better." Esther stopped to look at his face. Honesty there and a readiness to discover that it's not as simple as she had anticipated. She responded to her express a mixture of fatigue and optimism, but acknowledging the issue is the first step as they dug deeper into the inquiry, and Esther discovered that she valued Henry's observations and his. In their haste to comprehend the community they were attempting to safeguard, they started to establish a provisional bond united in there as she worked, her passion to bring justice to those who had been targeted. Esther and Henry were unable to overcome the sense of loneliness that had followed her since the event at the FBI admission. Years of similar events and the memory of that humiliation weighed heavily on as they were finishing up for the day. Esther found herself looking at her FBI badge one evening and feeling heartbroken. Touched its edges, feeling the burden of everything that symbolized her pride in her achievements, as well as the suffering of the Henrys saw her silence after she had gone through hardships. Yet Esther is doing oak. With turmoil in her eyes, she said, "I don't know Henry," but she also said, I believe in what I do, yet occasionally I question whether I can continue." Henry listened, his face full of pain, in a place that has harmed me so much. He showed compassion and empathy by just nodding rather than trying to downplay her sentiments or using meaningless platitudes. As they sat there in the silent office with the case files spread out in front of them, Esther acknowledged the gravity of what she had spoken, felt conflicted, but she was thankful for the advancements they were making in the fight for justice. However, she was still wondering if she could keep pushing for reform in a system that seemed unwilling to accept it. As the inquiry deepened, Esther and Henry's collaboration became more solid, and their joint efforts ultimately led them to a discovery they had determined that we have him. Esther continued, the gang leader who terrorizes the black-owned businesses. As she pinned a picture of a man with a hard face to the evidence board, her voice was full of resolve. Marcus Delaney, a notorious criminal with a hateful past, had icy eyes. Crimes Henry stood next to her, looking at the picture, and he nodded, his face fixed on decide what to do next. Esther inhaled deeply, and we decided to take this down. Concludes now, Esther and Henry spent the following 3 days putting together a high-stakes operation. They plotted access points, worked with local law police, and were ready for anything that might come up. Situation: Esther felt a newfound sense of purpose, even though the burden of responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. As the arrangements were arranged, Esther couldn't help but observe Henry's progress. He was no longer the knave. Instead of humiliating her, the security guard turned into a reliable ally. The night before the event, someone who truly cared about the neighborhood they were guarding. Esther stepped in front of her staff and gave a final explanation of the plan. Her eyes were fierce with resolve, and her voice was steady. Our community has suffered greatly and lived in anxiety because of these criminals. Tomorrow, we will bring them to with appreciation for her courage and leadership, just as Henry observed her from the rear of the room as the meeting came to an end, he said, "I've got your back, Esther. We're going to make this right tomorrow." Esther gave a slight nod. As dawn broke on the day of the event, she smiled and said, "I know Henry, thank you." Tension from the operation permeated the air as Esther and Henry prepared with their team, inspecting their equipment. The last time their bulletproof vests' weight felt like a tangible representation of the pressure they were. "This is it," Esther murmured as she glanced at her squad, her eyes lingering on Henry. "Let's bring these criminals to justice and give our community the peace they deserve," she said in a low but powerful voice. Deserved a final nod, and as they ascended, Esther led the way out of the building. The squad was prepared as they got into their vehicles, but they were all aware of the risks that awaited them. Esther and Henry exchanged a determined glance as they readied themselves for the encounter that would determine the outcome of their case. As Esther and Henry guided their crew towards safety, the early morning sun created long shadows. Tension pervaded the air like a dense fog in the deserted warehouse where Marcus Delaney and his group were sheltering. Esther's voice crackled over the radio, calm and steady. "Team Alpha, you're with me on the west. Henry, cover the back exit. Take the east entrance. Beta." As they got closer to the structure, Esther's heart thumped in her chest, reminding her that these men are dangerous and to remain vigilant. Was what they had been preparing for weeks. She looked to Henry, who nodded reassuringly, and FBI we, as Esther's voice is amplified over a megaphone, encircle the building and raise your hands. Everything was quiet for a while before turmoil broke out with the sound of, as gang members tried to escape, there was a lot of glass and shouting. So Esther and her group quickly entered the murky interior of the precision practice warehouse was a labyrinth of containers and machinery that was ideal for concealment, yet. Shots rang out as Esther dove behind a crate, but her team was ready as they made their way through the warehouse. As her training began to take effect, she saw one of the gang members and said, "Drop your weapon. You're under attack." Henry was busy making an arrest when two gang members stormed through the back exit, almost knocking him over, but Henry resisted, throwing one to the ground and yelling at the other to stop. Although the operation appeared to go on for hours, it was actually completed in a matter of minutes, with each gang member being Esther's leadership was evident as she led the group and made sure everyone was secure. Capturing the criminals, Esther finally met Marcus Delaney in person. Esther didn't flinch when the gang leader growled at her, his eyes blazing with fury. "Marcus Delaney, you're under," as she detained him. Esther sensed that he was being arrested for hate crimes against the black community, organized crime, extortion, and she feels a range of emotions, including pride, relief, and a sense that justice has been done yet. As the final member of the gang, a persistent doubt lingered outside of everything. Henry came up to Esther, and we did it after the members were taken into police vans. Esther nodded as he said, "You were incredible in there," with a tinge of amazement in his voice. She smiled a little, and we all said, "Thank you for having my back." Esther's smile dimmed as they watched the vans leave. The case was closed, although justice had been done. She had demonstrated that the memories of her humiliation at the FBI building still hurt. Herself again, but she continued to encounter prejudice and discrimination in the very organization she worked for. Henry saw that she was acting differently. "Esther, are you okay?" she said. "We won today, Henry," yet her eyes were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. In the days after Esther's successful operation, there is still a great deal of work to be done. She was stopped in the halls by FBI coworkers she hardly knew, making her the center of attention. Congratulate her. Her inbox was overflowing with notes complimenting her bravery and leadership, including from the director. He called to praise her for a job well done, but even with the praise, Esther sat feeling empty inside. Staring at another congratulatory email at her desk, she was unable to get rid of the sense of alienation that had been developing in her excellent work. And when an agent named Wallace called out to her as he walked by her office, Esther forced a grin and nodded, but her countenance sank as soon as he left. She should have been ecstatic, soaking up the brightness of her achievement, but instead she felt more isolated than ever, and her thoughts returned to the embarrassment from the encounter with Henry at the entry was still fresh in my mind. Overshadowing her previous victory, she had repeatedly demonstrated her abilities, and however, Esther sighed deeply as she opened a blank document on her computer. Her fingers briefly lingered over the keyboard before she started typing, "Dear Director Johnson," it's with the words came out with ease as I submitted my resignation from the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a heavy heart. Maybe too readily, Esther spilled her heart out on the television, describing her years of service, her commitment to justice, and the ongoing challenges she encountered as a black woman in the legal profession. As she typed, tears filled her eyes. This had been her career. Dream her calling, but the psychological toll was getting to be too much for her to handle. Esther paused her cursor, fed up with having to prove herself every time she was questioned and doubted. Was she truly prepared to abandon everything she had fought so hard for? She was blinking at the end of a paragraph. The notion caused her chest to tighten with worry, so she closed her eyes and sat back in her chair, looking at Mrs. Lewis's features. And she remembered the other black business owners she had assisted. They had gazed at her with such hope that thankfulness, but could she truly leave them? Henry's contemptuous expression envy. The weight of everything felt heavy when entrance reappeared together with all the other microaggressions she had experienced over the years. Crushingly, Esther opened her eyes and hovered her finger over the incomplete resignation letter on her laptop. Esther sat at her desk, quivering a little over the delete key, feeling torn. When a gentle knock on her office door interrupted her focus between remaining and going, she looked up to see Henry. Stood with a worried expression on his face in the doorway. Agent Wallace, do you have a— Esther nodded reluctantly as Henry asked, then closed her laptop to conceal the resignation letter Henry had stepped on. As he closed the door behind him, I noticed that you appeared to— Henry started out by saying, I know I'm probably troubled lately, carefully and measuredly. Esther was the last person you want to speak to, but I felt compelled to do so because she was silent and on guard. Henry took a big breath and went on, saying, I've been thinking a lot about this since that day at the entrance. You meeting Mrs. Lewis in this instance has opened my eyes to things I never knew existed. Before his voice became a little emotional, I was so oblivious, Esther, that I didn't realize how unjust and biased the world can be, and tears welled up in as he talked. Henry's eyes showed that what I had done to you that day was unacceptable. I had wasted. Since then, I've been attempting to confront my own behavior and understand why I did it. Prejudices, as Esther heard Henry's sincere remarks, she noticed her own eyes starting to well up. Working with you and witnessing your perseverance and courage has opened my eyes to the damage that people like myself can cause. Because you've taught me so much, Esther, without even realizing it. I've heard stories that Henry's voice became more urgent as he talked about improving as a human being and as a security officer, that you're considering quitting the FBI. Please, Esther, stay put. You're evolving and your presence here is crucial. When you opened your eyes, Esther felt a knot develop in her throat. The FBI needs individuals like you, but I realize it's unfair to ask you to stay and fight when you shouldn't have to, Henry added. You're truly changing things, Esther. If you go, who will be left to show people what they're missing? Esther sat quietly for a while, absorbing Henry's words and his earnestness. Touched her profoundly, and she felt tears threatening to well up in her eyes. She tried to stabilize herself by taking a long breath. Her feelings. Thank you, Henry, she murmured quietly. I appreciate your growth and honesty. Hearing you say these things as Henry exited her office, Esther, means a lot. Turned to face the window, her mind racing with contradictory ideas as she considered all of her cases. Recollections of the people she had impacted and the impact she had made during her time with the FBI filled her head. The relief on a victim's face when justice was delivered, the pride she felt, and the thankful smile of her rescued child. These instances had always been her motivation to keep going when solving a particularly difficult case, even on the worst days, but then the agonizing memories came to the surface. Stares, hushed doubts, and the ongoing need to justify herself. The Henry event wasn't unique. Was only one instance of the numerous instances of microaggressions and overt discrimination that Esther had encountered during her work. She closed her eyes. Considering that quitting the FBI would mean forsaking her lifelong desire, she felt the weight of her decision. That had long characterized her, but remaining meant continuing to fight a difficult battle, not just criminals, as well as the biases in her own organization. She considered the young black girls who admired her and saw what message would be sent if she left. She was a beacon of hope and a role model. Would they view it as a necessary act of self-preservation or as a sign of surrender? Outside her window, the city was bathed in a warm glow as the sun started to set. Esther's viewpoint changed. Perhaps she believed that leaving wasn't the perhaps staying was the true struggle and the true chance for transformation. And keeping up the internal battle, she reflected on the strides she had already achieved and the attitudes she had transformed. Like Henry's, couldn't she have the same effect on others if she could have it on just one? Esther became a catalyst for more extensive reform within the FBI after realizing that her work there was about more than just advancing her career. It was about being a voice for those who would follow her, about representation, and about providing opportunities for There was a soft knock on the door while Esther sat in her office, still lost in thought, and those who had been quiet for too long heard it. She looked up, breaking off her reflection, to see Mrs. Lewis, an elderly black entrepreneur. Mrs. Lewis, who had been at the heart of their most recent case, was standing in the doorway grinning warmly. "Please come in and tell me what brought you here," Esther murmured, hastily getting to her feet to greet her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," but Mrs. Lewis entered the office slowly, looking about before focusing on Esther. Esther gestured. "Anything important, Agent Wallace? I just had to come and personally thank you for everything you've done." For Mrs. Lewis to sit down and experience a range of feelings, "You didn't to travel this far, but I'm happy to see you. How are you, Mrs. Lewis?" She sat down in the chair, her eyes sparkling, and said, "Thanks to you, I'm doing much better now. I was afraid I might lose everything I had worked so hard for over the years when difficulties with those goons began." Esther nodded, recalling the terror in Mrs. Lewis's eyes when they first met. "I'm simply relieved that we are able to assist Mrs. Lewis. It is our responsibility to safeguard the neighborhood, but Mrs. Lewis stated that there is more to it than that. You have no idea how much it meant to me and the others of the neighborhood to have you take the lead in this investigation. It gave us hope to witness a strong, accomplished black woman in authority standing up for us." As you can see, Esther developed a lump in her throat. Beyond resolving the issue, Mrs. Lewis hadn't thought about how her presence might have affected the neighborhood, maintained her emotionally charged speech, which I never imagined seeing when I was younger. "The day when someone who like us is in your shoes, you're an inspiration, Wallace, not simply to the children, but to everyone else who has been battling our own issues for years." Esther found herself regressing. "Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. Sometimes it's difficult to express gratitude without crying. When you're in the thick of things, I'm here to remind you that Mrs. Lewis stated unequivocally that you must. You have no idea how much your appearance in that FBI jacket matters. It demonstrates our Esther thought that, as Mrs. Lewis said, we can make it that we belong in these positions of power too." Something changed within her, and a renewed sense of purpose took the place of her previous uncertainties. She came to understand that her job at the FBI involved more than just cracking cases or establishing her worth. It was about. Esther inhaled deeply as she spoke of being a beacon of hope for her neighborhood. Mrs. Lewis' remarks had resonated deeply with her, reminding her of the sudden resolve that had settled over her. Mrs. Lewis Esther's speech was full of the greater good she served. Emotion, "I'm really grateful that you came here today. You've given me a new perspective." "You just keep doing what?" Mrs. Lewis obviously reached out and touched Esther's hand. When Mrs. Lewis departed, Esther sat at the door, "And you're doing it. Agent Wallace, we need you out there." Her desk, focusing on the partially completed resignation letter and shaking her head resolutely, realized that leaving wasn't the solution, so she crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. Instead, Esther took out and started writing on a new piece of paper, but this time it wasn't a letter of resignation. However, she put her all into a proposal for a diversity and inclusion program within the FBI, based on. As she wrote about her personal experiences and the tales she had heard from people in her neighborhood, Esther felt a renewed sense of purpose. She came to understand that her job at the FBI was more than just case solving. It involved being it. As a trailblazer, she considered all the young black girls who may witness her opening doors for others who would follow her. Her and want to work in law enforcement, as Mrs. Lewis had mentioned. The following day, Esther set up a meeting with her bosses to talk about her idea. She was prepared for the challenge, even though she knew it wouldn't be simple. Obstacle, she held her head high and felt a renewed sense of strength as she passed past FBI headquarters. To her astonishment, she discovered Henry standing outside her office. Seemed anxious but resolute. Agent Wallace added, "I heard. You were organizing a diversity program, and I wanted to know whether their." Esther looked at him for a while, and when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, she knew that change might come from unexpected places and that allies may be discovered in unexpected places, she remarked, referring to Henry. As they walked in, I smiled slightly and thought maybe they might come on in and talk. Esther felt a spark of hope in her office. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was prepared to face it. Head on with each action she performed, each case she resolved, and each thought she recognized it was worth fighting for, and she was paving the road for a more inclusive future. Henry's forehead was furrowed in concentration as he sat at his desk and stared at his computer screen. Poured over training materials on diversity and inclusion, the last few weeks have been a learning frenzy, and Henry had made it his goal to become an expert in self reflection ever since his enlightening encounter with Esther. He went through the slides, taking thorough notes on subjects like unconscious prejudice and promoting change within the FBI. He had never before fully grasped the concepts of racial profiling. Now that they struck a deep chord with him, Henry couldn't help but wince as he thought back to his own discriminatory behavior toward Esther, but rather than allowing shame to stop him, he turned it into motivation for his newly discovered love for. Thompson Henry encouraged inclusivity by calling out to a fellow cop who was walking by his desk, "I'd like to show you something." Thompson stopped to look. Wondering what's going on, Henry pointed to his screen and said, "I've been working on this." As Henry outlined the diversity training program, "I believe it might have a significant impact here." Thompson's eyes glowed with excitement as he discussed the significance of identifying unconscious biases and how they might have an effect on their work. Thompson listened and nodded slowly in comprehension. Appeared on his face across the room, and Esther observed the conversation with a mix of pride and bewilderment. Couldn't help but smile when she witnessed Henry fervently elucidating the ideas she had been living with all of her life. Unlike the man who had confronted her at the door only a few months prior, Henry came up later that day. Agent Wallace, sitting at Esther's desk, grinned nervously and stated, "I wanted to. Once again, thank you for your patience and strength. I hope it has transformed me." Esther looked up at him, her face softening. "What I'm doing now can help make things better around here." "You've come long ago," Henry stated. "Confronting your own biases is difficult, but you're doing it and you're helping others do the same." The saying that requires bravery, Henry nodded appreciatively as he turned to. "Henry, we need more people like you." "Leave?" Esther yelled out to him. His chest grew with resolve as Henry left, pushing for change because he knew there was still a long way off, but he was dedicated to the process, and with every training session and chat he was making the FBI a more welcoming place, and Esther watched him leave with it. She felt a glimmer of optimism and decided to stay and fight for change. Now that she wasn't battling alone, she might have believed that the FBI was about to undergo a significant change. As the weeks went by, Esther discovered that she was approaching her work with renewed purpose and energy, despite the weight that had previously weighed down on her shoulders, and started to raise the representative as she moved through the FBI with a spirit of optimism and resolve. One morning, Esther arrived at headquarters with her head held high and no longer doubting her position within the company. Henry was in the office, setting up a presentation in the conference room, so she was interested and stuck her head in to see what was going on. "Oh, Agent, this Henry looked up with a smile on his face. "I'm happy you're here, Wallace. Would you like to join us for a lecture about our new diversity initiatives?" As more agents arrived, Esther nodded and sat down in the rear of the room to observe Henry get ready, using a combination of this pride and awe were a long cry from Henry, the man who had previously treated her with such contempt and distrust. Started his presentation with a confident and clear voice. "Today, we'll talk about how important it is to recognize and confronting our own prejudices," he said, "is important even though it's not always simple. For establishing an equitable and welcoming workplace." As Henry mentioned, Esther discovered she nodded as she went, catching the attention of a young black female agent who was paying close attention. She looked relieved, and Esther's expression of approval when she recognized the actual significance of as they were making adjustments following the presentation. Esther went up to Henry, which was actually wonderful, she remarked. "You've come so far, Henry. I'm proud of you." Cheeks flushed with emotion. "Thank you, Esther. Without your forbearance and strength, I couldn't have succeeded. Altered my life." Esther grinned and put a hand on his shoulder, saying, We're in together. They are now partners in change as they left the conference room next to each other. Esther experienced a wave of hope that the journey ahead would to present difficulties, but with supporters like Henry at her side, she was no longer dealing with them alone. A noticeable shift. Perhaps they stopped in front of a window that looked out over the city. Esther turned to face Henry, her eyes gleaming with resolve, determined to change things. She questioned, and Henry nodded, his face continually reflecting hers. Esther responded, feeling at peace as they stood there, gazing out at the world they were trying to make better. Wash over her, she decided to stay and fight, and that battle has now turned into a agreed that they would keep working for progress, one step at a time. If you liked Henry and Esther's story, I've handpicked this one for you. That will move you, so please watch it by clicking this link.